Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to completely rethink everything you thought you knew about India's indigenous communities. Think about it for a second. When you hear the word tribe, what pops into your head? Some isolated group living deep in a forest? Ancient, unchanging traditions? Well, get ready to have those baseline assumptions completely flipped on their head because the reality? It's far more complex, it's deeply political, and honestly, it is absolutely fascinating.
Let's actually start with the word itself. Tribe is, believe it or not, a modern colonial-era invention. It was basically cooked up as an administrative convenience by colonial rulers. And here's the crazy part. They defined these incredibly diverse communities entirely by what they were not. They literally just grouped them as people with no written text, no centralized state, and no caste division. It's wild. They were defined entirely by absences rather than their actual, rich, everyday lives.
And listen, we aren't just talking about a small handful of people here. The scale of this demographic is absolutely staggering. Over 104 million tribal persons live in India today. Let that sink in for a second. That's about 8.6% of the country's entire population. 104 million unique individuals, all historically lumped together under this single, made-up colonial umbrella term.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to trace the journey from historical myths right up to modern political agency. We'll deconstruct the term tribe, dive into the historic tribe-caste debate, look at the impact of colonialism, weigh the incredibly heavy cost of national development, and finally, look at how modern tribal identity is being fiercely forged today.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, deconstructing the term tribe and mapping out exactly where these 104 million diverse individuals actually live.
So, geographically speaking, there is a massive concentration here. A whopping 85% of the tribal population lives right in Middle India. That's a wide band stretching all the way from Gujarat over to West Bengal. Now, compare that to the northeastern states, which hold about 11%, leaving just a tiny 4% sliver scattered across the rest of the country.
But what's truly mind-blowing is the sheer diversity hidden behind that one tiny label. Tribe is absolutely not a monolith. I mean, you have massive groups like the Gons, the Bills, and the Santals that are over 1 million strong each. But then, on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, you've got Andamanese Islander communities numbering just in the hundreds. And linguistically, they're just as distinct. They primarily speak Austric and Tibeto-Burman languages, which completely separates them from the broader Indo-Aryan and Dravidian language groups spoken across the rest of India.
Moving right along to Section 2, the tribe-caste debate. Are they a continuum or completely separate? Back in the 1960s, academics were actually locked in a fierce debate over how to classify these societies.
So the big obsession in that era was trying to contrast their assumed cultural differences. On one side, academics looked at Hindu peasant societies structured around caste, defined by deep beliefs in purity, pollution, and really strict hierarchy. On the other side, they placed what they called animist tribes, categorizing them as inherently egalitarian, operating entirely on kinship-based social structures. It was framed so neatly, hierarchy versus equality.
But as a bustling, vibrant village fair perfectly illustrates, by the 1970s, that super neat academic binary was proven totally faulty. Real life is just way too messy. The realities on the ground were far too complex in size, isolation, and livelihood to just shove into one box. You had massive tribes spread across huge territories doing settled farming, while at the exact same time, non-tribal castes in certain areas were actually surviving by hunting and gathering. The strict lines, they just blurred completely.
Historically, tribes were never just static entities trapped in some sort of time capsule. They were continually absorbed into mainstream Hindu society by adopting dominant customs, a process known as Sanskritization. Now, the big academic divide here is how you view that process. Some scholars look at this long span of Indian history and see a natural, parallel process of assimilation. But others, they look at the exact same history and see an exploitative conquest, where tribal lands were essentially colonized, forests were cut down, and these groups were forced right onto the lowest rungs of a rigid hierarchy.
This brings us to Section 3, Colonial Impact and Attitudes. It's time to bust the myth of the pristine tribe.
See, long before colonial rule, Adivasis, the original inhabitants, were incredibly active political and economic agents. They weren't isolated at all. There were actually several really powerful Gond kingdoms in central India. They formed local militias that completely dominated the plains. They even controlled highly specialized, incredibly lucrative trade networks, dealing in forest produce, salt, and, get this, even elephants. They were major players in the regional economy and power structures way before the British ever showed up.
But under colonialism, everything shifted. By the 1940s, a massive, highly polarized debate emerged about what mainstream society should, quote-unquote, do with the tribes. The isolationists argued that tribals were fragile groups that needed absolute protection from traders and missionaries who just wanted to exploit them. On the flip side, the integrationists argued that tribals were merely backward Hindus who needed welfare and rapid assimilation. The really crucial takeaway here? Both sides of this debate viewed the tribes as problems to be solved, rather than equals who had their own agency.
Which leads perfectly into Section 4, the cost of national development and the squeeze of progress. As we move into the post-independence era, we really have to pause and ask an uncomfortable question. Who actually pays the price for a nation's progress?
The push for national development in the Nehruvian era was intense. We're talking building massive dams, setting up factories, introducing private property, and aggressively mining for minerals. But this created a really harsh reality. Because those mineral-rich and heavily forested areas were overwhelmingly located right in tribal regions, the impact on them was absolutely devastating. It led to massive losses of the forest they relied on, forced displacement, like we saw with the infamous series of dams on the Narmada River, and fundamentally shattered communities. The progress of the new nation came at the disproportionate expense of tribal land.
In that squeeze, it didn't stop at just losing physical resources. There was immense demographic dilution. As industrial hubs sprang up in places like Jharkhand, massive waves of non-tribal workers flooded in looking for jobs, which completely overwhelmed the local demographics. The most dramatic example has to be the state of Tripura. They literally saw their tribal share of the population drop by half in a single decade. Half! They were reduced to a minority in their own homeland. So the key point here is that tribes weren't just losing land, they were being demographically swallowed up right in their own backyards.
Finally, Section 5. Modern identity and resistance. Let's look at how these intense, historic pressures have forged a completely new, incredibly resilient future.
Seeing powerful agitation led by tribal women brilliantly drives home the point that modern tribal identity isn't just about ancient traits or isolated customs anymore. No way. Today, it is an identity actively constructed through fierce resistance and opposition to the overwhelming force of the non-tribal world. It's a highly politicized, undeniably modern identity fighting tooth and nail for survival and autonomy.
We can really track how this plays out in the political landscape today. Decades of long, hard-fought struggles actually achieved some major victories, like gaining full statehood for Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh. But we have to recognize that this success is deeply moderated. In many northeastern states, citizens live under special laws that severely limit their civil liberties compared to the rest of India. And sadly, this creates an ongoing vicious cycle in certain areas, where state repression fuels armed rebellions, which in turn brings down even heavier state repression, taking just a terrible toll on tribal culture and the economy.
But, there's another major shift happening internally right now. Thanks to education and reservation policies, a new urbanized professional middle class is emerging within these communities. And this is creating entirely new internal dynamics. Think about it. Why an educated middle-class tribal professional asserts their identity might be vastly different from why a poor, uneducated tribal laborer joins a land rights movement. The movements are diverging, split between ethnic and cultural recognition on one hand and vital, raw economic survival on the other.
Which brings us to the ultimate question we really have to ask as we wrap up this explainer. Moving forward, will internal dynamics or external forces shape the future of India's tribes? From surviving historical exploitation and busting the myth of the pristine tribe, to bearing the immense costs of national development, and now seeing the rise of a politically savvy, educated middle class, the evolution of these 104 million individuals is just staggering. But as they become more internally diverse while still facing massive external pressures over land and resources, whose vision will ultimately determine their future? Honestly, think about that. Thank you so much for diving deep with me today on The Explainer, and as always, keep questioning what you think you know.